it's identical language to the state. And so it's reasonable to think that whatever law applies to the state applies to the city as well, because the language is identical. That's a common precept of statutory interpretation in the law. If the language is identical, probably means the same thing. It's simple enough. And so it effectively means that there's nothing explicit in the city, state, or federal law that will prohibit non-citizen voting in New York City. And so if it were passed, in theory, it could be challenged. Any law could be challenged in the courts, no matter how clear it seems to be on its face. But it's a toss-up as to how a court would decide either way. It's unclear. But there's nothing explicit in the law. That's sort of the moral of the story that would prohibit non-citizen voting.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to thank actually all of our panelists for putting forth some very compelling perspectives, different perspectives about non-citizen voting. So now we'd like to actually open this up to see if members of the audience have particular questions or opinions that they'd like to share. And I'd actually like to kick off this section by asking folks on the panel who support non-citizen voting to say, do you support non-citizen voting in the way in which the bill is currently written, which is essentially folks who are lawfully present here in New York City for at least 6 months? And that actually leaves out folks who are undocumented. So for folks who do support non-citizen voting, do you agree that undocumented folks should not be included? Do you think, or where exactly would you draw the line if there was a line to be drawn?
That's on. That's an ethical question. I can just speak. That's an ethical question that I think we should address. However, I also understand, in practical terms, that this is a comparatively liberal state, a blue state, and it can't even pass the Dream Act. So we have a situation that, as he mentioned before, that is kind of anti-immigrant, even in New York State. So I would not want to feed that movement of the New York Post and the Daily News that are going to come out like gangbusters against Mayor de Blasio for even thinking about signing a bill that I know Antonio and his colleagues in the City Council are going to pass. So would I want people who are not citizens? Absolutely, because let me give you one example. And this is just one example of many that we've had to deal with at a point. A young woman, brilliant, works real hard, gets good grades, gets a 4-year scholarship to a nursing school. She was delighted, and she was, a wonderful example of what the Academy for Peace and Justice, where we have the founding principle right here, First Public High School for Human Rights in America, can do for young people. Only to get a letter a month later from the same admissions committee denying her entrance to the school and the scholarship. Because as they put it in the letter, we understand that you're not a citizen, and therefore you cannot be licensed, you cannot become a registered nurse, and therefore we think it only fair that we give the scholarship to someone who can. That young woman is waiting on tables today. That's what I'm talking about. That's the craziest I'm talking about. But we've got to end that. That one could be theoretically allowed to go to school, to have the Dream Act, to be able to stand until we deal with this craziness of immigration that we need to deal with on a federal level. I'll also say that it's given. I would love for it to be New York State. Right? But I understand that there are pockets of reaction to this through the state, and I can't come up with another explanation as to why the governor has not led in this effort and made it happen, because we certainly have people in the Assembly, and even people in the Senate, I think, who would go along with this, in terms of the DREAM Act anyway. So I don't know why that hasn't happened. But I will say that, the issue in terms of women's rights to vote and non-citizen voting is quite different. In one case, we're talking about the human race article, the ability of women to be equal as men under the law. And in fact, it's horrible that we had to fight for that. It's also horrible that we basically, when we created our Constitution, basically did not consider a black man a person, a full 100% person. It's terrible stuff. It's the mortal sin of the United States. So, but we can't compare that. We're not talking about the rules that a society has set up to name its citizens. Kind of different. And we're saying that those rules have to be modified to include everyone, because the very rules right now are a barrier to the creation of community, which is what democracy is driven by.
Kevin?
So, Steve, I think that's a really interesting question, and one that the coalition that's working on this has thought about. And I think our position is, if you look at the scale of the problem, and that's actually the first step, I think, is to admit we have a problem here in New York City, and that's that 1.3 million non-citizens are living and working here in the city and don't have the right to vote. Some portion of that population, depending on estimates, maybe 500,000, are undocumented and would not be impacted by this legislation. We see this legislation, which is focused purely on those that have a legal status in the city, as potentially a good first step. There may be an advancement of this legislation beyond some point in the future, but this campaign is really focused on the legal residents of the city. We think that's a really important first step. And just for the folks in this audience, there's over 31,000 folks here in Williamsburg who fall into that category. We're non-citizens who can't vote, many of them legal residents, and we think that should change.
Let me just add that, I agree with the legislation you proposed. There's going to be enough opposition. If you were to open it up to, residents and also consider illegal immigrants, I think that the opposition would be so hard that, it wouldn't go anywhere. So from a practical standpoint, you have to go with a more logical point of view of, residents. In particular, people like my father, 40 years, resident, how can you argue against his right to have a voice in the decisions that are being impacted? But as far as the conversation about a second tier of citizens, the reality is that I don't think anyone, just because they're allowed to vote at the city level, the municipal level, will stop reaching for the dream of becoming a citizen with all the rights and privileges that come with it. And, I know that Antonio doesn't do it this way because he's a council member of principle and somebody that we know and love and grew up in our community and cares. But the reality is that politicians are looking at numbers. And when you have 31,000 non-citizens that live, pay taxes, and work in Williamsburg, and they're not allowed to vote, when it's time for a politician to figure out who to give money to, they're going to say, well, in Williamsburg, there are not a lot of people voting for me, so let me go to the north side, let me go to Bushwick, let me go somewhere else. So there is an impact on those non-citizens, political impact, and economic impact, because they don't have the right to be seen, heard, and felt by the elected officials that are there sworn to, take care of them politically. So I think it is a two-tier citizenship that we have now, and I think that by giving the non-citizens the right to vote, you will really level the playing field for the political standpoint.
Just to answer the question initially, I support it personally because I think what's proposed right now, the intro 410, what class was, I support it because I think it's necessary, but insufficient. It's necessary, I think, because it's absolutely essential that we have suffrage for all the people that share the city, and not just some. But I think it's insufficient so far, and it doesn't expand it to undocumented persons. The law in Maryland right now in 6 or 7 counties extends it to everyone who resides in those counties, regardless of immigration status. So even if we pass this law, Maryland would still be ahead of us in that respect. So it clearly has worked. It may sound extreme to some people, but it's been operating for years in Maryland. And I think, in my sense, to this. Part of the opposition, part of the resistance, I think is just a lack of legal education. I think a lot of people are under the assumption that, oh, if you want citizenship, you can work toward it. You can't in most situations. Citizenship is barred to most people who are not born here. You can't even ask for citizenship unless you have a green card. And you can't get a green card, usually, unless you have a family member who's already a citizen or a green card holder, or you are eligible for some other very rare form of relief like asylum, which is not easy to get. So there are many, many people who want to have full participation in American society, who have a right to, but who are denied that because the immigration laws are so exclusive, create so many barriers to reaching citizenship, reaching a green card, that so many people simply can't get it. The reason there are 12 million undocumented people living in the United States is because they simply can't access citizenship. If they could, of course they would. So I think that's a part of it. And I think that also I think there's a lot of fear, and I think a lot of us feel intimidated by the proposition of passing this law and then incurring the wrath of members of our society who would be very outraged about it. But I would hope that passing this kind of law would give us an opportunity to educate that group about citizenship, about suffrage, and about a number of other issues that this calls upon.
And one of all the things you just said, let's take it out into the audience if anyone has any questions or comments that they might want to make. Councilmember?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I do want to say in the next forum, hoping that we have interpreters, because a lot of our population is going to be Spanish speaking that we want to get to. And it kind of speaks to the argument that I would make, is that the conversation right now is going to be dictated by a bunch of folks that can't necessarily relate to non-citizen voting rights. Like myself, I grew up a citizen. Like my father and my mother, whether earn it or work for it. I was just born into it. But I do want to say that conversation regarding the Dream Act is a perfect example of why we do need it in the city of New York. The city of New York has been the progressive vehicle of change here in our communities. And we need to continue that. We need to continue that type of effort. And if we do it in the city, maybe it'll be the first drop in the bucket to getting it done nationally. For a long time, there's been folks that don't support the Dream Act because they think it's one step in a more comprehensive conversation about immigration reform. But in doing so, completely alienate or marginalize an entire swath of our community. There are districts in the city council, like Danny Jones district and some like Peter Cruz district, in which the majority of the population is non-citizen. And they have no say as to how they operate politically. Which is unfair. But what else is unfair is that Danny Drum and Peter and Koo still represent that community and have the burden or the responsibility to represent a community that has no voice in a way that other communities, like in Staten Island, for example, they don't have that burden. They don't have that responsibility and don't take on those challenges. And those are resources that we're spending and we're using to try to give a voice to people that don't have it. Once this passes, though, everything will change. People will start paying attention to huge portions of the community that are under-resourced, that need all the help they can possibly get. And we will also begin the process of civic engagement, which is absolutely absent, not only in non-voting communities, but mostly in the voting communities. You'll see that the traditions and the culture of where these people come from, specifically, let's say, Dominicans, where voting is very important. Over 80 to 90% of the country is voting. They care, they understand the value of it. It'll change the entire dynamic of the landscape of our what we do here politically. And I think it's great. And I think it'll sustain what we need. It'll allow for us to now not have to wait for the Dream Act because we have inoperable or we don't have great politicians in the city. The people can change that. So I have supported. I signed on some piece of legislation. Whether or not the mayor vetoes it, I think is going to be insignificant because we're going to have a veto-proof majority, and I'm looking forward to the day when we get to do it. Hopefully, no legal challenges in it. And I get 31,000 new people to vote, and this country was also built on thank you for your time. And I actually have to run out, but I really appreciate this forum, and I want to be a part of the movement to get the 200 people in here. And I think we can absolutely do it, and I'm looking forward to working with everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman.
Before you leave, just on the 30,000, I understand in that election that Diana just barely won, that she only won by about 44 votes.
250.
250, that's right. I mean, just imagine that's how close we came to losing a fantastic lead 4 years ago. Another reason why we cannot afford to continue this crazy system.
A person that was speaking for a non-voting population and in turn hurting herself by not focusing solely on voting citizens. And I think that is a disservice to our democracy. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Anyone else? We have questions ourselves to ask. Any other questions from the audience? Or yes, please.
Sorry, I think I can just speak loudly. We're speaking to a couple of immigration advocates here in the community about, preparing for tonight, and their concern, and these are folks who are providing legal assistance to undocumented folks, that there is a possibility that allowing non-citizen voting and participating as a non-citizen voter might affect their process to become legal citizens and might negatively impact their ability to become citizens. Is that the case?
Thanks, Steve. You gonna take that?
Sure, I can speak to that. So I think the concern that you're referring to is that for many kinds of immigration relief, you have to actually tell the government whether or not you voted unlawfully. So if you want to apply for citizenship, for example, or for your green card, you have to tell the government, have you ever voted unlawfully? And if you have, you can borrow that relief. But of course, if it was lawful in a district, you wouldn't be voting unlawfully. The other concern is that, well, what if by voting within the municipal election, you might accidentally vote in a national election and thereby violate federal law? So there's 2 points on that. The first is that the legislation that is being proposed at the City Council has anticipated that concern, and you would be getting a separate ballot were you a non-citizen voting that would not include a state or national candidate. And so that would sort of address that problem. In addition to that, there's actually federal case law that says that if you voted contrary to the law, you voted in a federal election contrary to the law, because you were led to do so by a municipality, it doesn't count against you. That's kind of a concept in law called reliance, or estoppel, if you prefer. If you relied on an authority figure, they encouraged you to break the law, then it's not held against you. And so that not only the case law, I think, protects someone if they somehow accidentally voted against the law, but I think the way it's set up in the legislation, it would prevent that from happening.
I actually just want to add one other kind of safety that is kind of built into this, just by virtue of how the election cycles work. This legislation is only granting municipal voting rights in city elections, which tend to occur in odd years here in the city, whereas our state and federal elections are predominantly in the even number of years. So that reduces the likelihood of voting in an election you're supposed to. The exceptions would be special elections or other kind of unique situations, but for the most part, there's that kind of barrier or safety to the point Steve was making.
I have a follow-up question. One of the concerns that's come out of our Immigrants Vote campaign has been the issue of voter harassment at poll sites. The fact of the matter is that when folks go in to vote, whether it's you or I or anybody, there are poll workers there, and we have documented a whole host of concerns about poll workers who have asked immigrants or people who look like immigrants to show their ID, to prove that they're actually on the voter roll. That their names are actually spelled correctly. Sometimes they get quizzical looks and hostile looks when they ask for an interpreter. So one of the things that we as a coalition and our partners have consistently done is we have thought back and said, you can't start to discriminate on the basis of appearance, what this person looks for, and to ask for their ID and such. Now, when we are talking about a completely separate ballot, then almost one concern that I heard is that you're opening the door for racial profiling of these voters, and the fact of the matter is that a lot of these poll site workers, they're going to take this as essentially carte blanche to discriminate against these voters to prove this And so how do you respond to that concern?
So others may want to join in, but one of the things is that it's explicit in the legislation at least that there be a single poll list, so it is not clear to the voters or to the poll workers who is necessarily registered on either list. They just see that they're an eligible voter, so that would reduce it to some extent. I think the other part of that is there is always going to be backlash and discrimination against whether it's women, whether it's people who identify with different genders, and people might assume by looking at them, whether it's immigrants, whether it's by race, and we limit ourselves if we are intrepid about moving forward on progressive piece of legislation because we are fearful of what the negative effects might be. I think it falls to us to make sure that we're doing our best to mitigate them and plan for them and work with the community to make sure that they don't happen. So yes, there will be backlash if this happens, and it will be unfortunate, and it will be our job to have a really strong response to that and make sure we say that's not acceptable in New York City. We'll need the mayor, we'll need the speaker, we'll need all of us to say we're all residents of the community, and this is not appropriate in our city.
Having once run round of elections and a regular watcher of the city board of elections, part of what they do and what we're doing is to make sure we properly train poll workers not to discriminate against voters, whether based on looks or whatever, not to discriminate. A person is registered to vote, they're allowed to vote. If you don't know how to spell their name, ask them how to spell it. If you can't find it in the book, yes, it's permissible to ask them to see what they look like so they can find it. And a lot of times there's human error by the board, and so a person's name can be misfiled, not intentionally, there's human error. Second, it's impossible to have, you can have a unified list, there's no problem with that. But if you're going to have a list that calls for a separate ballot, because even in municipal elections like last year, you still had offices for state court judges, for civil court, and for Brooklyn DA. You have to have a separate ballot, and the only way to know a person would deserve a separate municipal ballot would have to give something marking as such requiring that, and then handing it to them. You would not then say, well, if a poll worker cannot say, because you're getting a municipal ballot because you're a non-citizen, I want to see further ID. That's not what they're required to do. Person is registered, they get a ballot, whichever one they get, no questions asked. You direct them to the machine where they can vote and end the discussion.
How does Tacoma or Maryland and those other counties in Maryland handle this, similar situation? Do they have a single voter file, voter list? Do they have separate ballots depending upon your status?
That's a great question. I'm actually not sure what the details on the ground are in terms of how Tacoma executes their elections. We definitely need to look into that. But I think also
That's the first time I've asked a question. You have not had an answer. I'm stunned.
so am I. I'm feeling very ashamed. But next time, I'll have an answer. But to speak, Michael's absolutely right. You do need a separate ballot, but the way the proposed legislation is written, there would actually be an N for municipal next to the name of someone who would get the municipal ballot. And so that's the way the proposed legislation would handle it, so that you would not have to ask any questions with respect to their immigration status. That discussion should not occur under this legislation.
Yeah, under the old system of the lever machines, you could have adjusted it so that you'd lock out certain positions like voting for civil courts, Supreme Court, any other state positions like DA. You could have locked it out the way you lock it out in primary for Democrats and Republicans. You can also lock it out for municipal. The person could then cast their vote. But when you vote now, you have to have a separate ballot.
Are you advocating that we return to the old legal machines?
I like that lever machine. They're almost moving.
Let me just say that, ignorance is a deterrent for problems. And I know that Louis went beyond that. In Williamsburg, we've had discriminatory practices throughout, from walls, schools, separate by equal, etc. So we rather have that challenge of fighting and pushing back at ignorance than not having the voting right of a huge group of constituency that we have in Williamsburg.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm super inspired by the Bronx being so clean. But in Brooklyn, our situation is such that even voters are harassed. People with, proof that they are citizens, everything is going on because some of the people who work, it's shocking, Michael, some of the people who work as poll watchers are actually agents of certain political people. And they're being told before they go on, push this person. And if you think the person's going to be voting the other way, make it hard. And we found that time and time again. Now, one of the good reasons not to start with undocumented, though I agree with you, obviously, because my family's had to go through that process of being undocumented, is the fact that the reality, when we went to ran the school board elections last week, we realized that not many undocumented people would come out to vote. Why? Because they were so afraid. Now, do you think an undocumented person, I'll tell you, my family, it's not going to happen, would come out and say, I'm undocumented, but I know I have a right to vote? No way. And in fact, what might happen is that people who are legal here might fear being identified as being undocumented and not want to vote. So maybe it's good to start this with, legally, because this way it avoids that situation and at the same time gets everyone involved in the process. Fear is what we're talking about here. It's the 500-pound gorilla in the middle of the room. Look, right now, the majority of babies in America are white, not white. They're people of color. And the majority of those are Latino. What's happening in New York City? The majority is not white. And the majority of those are Latino. So what do you think is happening to people who feel, America's about being white and Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, whatever that has to be today because the Supreme Court is Catholic. What do you think they feel, right? They're worried, they're afraid. And when they see these hordes of Dominicans and Latinos all of a sudden who are not even citizens, why should they vote? That's what's really happening. Now, I have to tell you that we have a lot of principled people in our community that love America, but they will not lie. They will not disown the Dominican Republic, which is what they have to do. Take an oath and say, I'm just swearing my allegiance to you and to nobody else. Under no circumstances will some of us do that. And we would find and sustain. If we can't say the truth, then we'll stay as legal green card holders. That's another thing I'm talking about. One of my young people at Puente said, here's what I did, Luis. I went like this, and behind my back, so basically, I wasn't really lying. We legally can't have dual citizenship. Unless I think you're an Israeli citizen, I'm not sure.
In the United States, but in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's
right. So, yeah, you can't. So, that's another issue. So it's not just that we don't want to become citizens, but there's a real moral impediment to do that.
As you talk about the Dominican Republic, it's reminding me of one of the other kind of really important parts of this conversation, which is the United States is really behind the game on this. There are over 45 countries around the world who have some form of, quote-unquote, non-citizen voting. And these are countries that you would probably be surprised. For decades in the European Union, there's been reciprocal voting rights for many of the countries there, whether it's the UK or England. We have all the continents around this world. Countries have recognized that people move, that to a certain extent borders don't matter, but matters is someone where someone puts down their allegiance and where they live and where they contribute to the community. And they've recognized that to varying degrees their ability to vote in elections. Some of them go all the way to the federal, some are kind of a patchwork, like we have here in the United States, where some counties and districts permitted. But I think it's really important to recognize that this is not, this great big progressive thing we're pushing, but this is decades old and around the world, and it's just really, we're behind on this one.
Yes.
Hi, I had two questions. The first is a point of clarification. I'm not sure exactly where the DA and civil and Supreme Courts fall in terms of jurisdiction legally. Clearly they're not federal, but I thought they were maybe county officials, but maybe that's not correct. correct?
The local officials of the state office.
Their state, interesting, okay. The other thing is, the consideration before the council is for a 6-month residency requirement. Now, this would not necessarily have any connection with whether or not someone's paid taxes, which I thought was a very convincing argument, but would also include people who are legal voters of other nations. And I wonder if that's been addressed, especially as we're bringing up this international component. How has that been dealt with in other countries, and is there a consideration for that within the bill?
Well, first, it's worth noting that plenty of U.S. citizens don't pay taxes. And they vote. But I'm not sure, I'm also not sure on how there's so many nations that do it. I'm not sure on how they actually manage their particular non-citizen voting provisions. That's about it.
I'm not sure if particular side there, but I think the important point around the 6 months is that was intended to make sure that there's a degree of connection and commitment to New York City that is above and beyond what is required of any of us. If when I moved here from Philadelphia, I had 30 days and I was eligible to vote. If I moved to another state, it's a much smaller period. The idea behind the 6-month residency is we want to make sure that people are here, committed, and really part of the city. And the other important part is that it really limits the people who would be here on a travel visa or kind of a temporary visa. This is really geared to those people who are here on a more long-term basis for work, employment, school, or other endeavors.
I think it's very interesting. I'm just thinking about my situation. My mother couldn't read or write. Our income was less than one would get on welfare, so we paid no taxes. And yet, she could vote. So, and yet my father's family couldn't, in the same situation.
There's a problem though. You can't, the registration form, you could not, you wouldn't have to provide proof of your 6 months residence. Because presently, on the registration cards, you don't have to provide proof of your citizenship either. You just have to sign an affidavit basically saying, I'm a U.S. citizen and I can go to New York, and you provide the last 4 numbers of your Social Security. We're now going to ask persons who are non-citizens to now sign an affidavit saying that they've been here in New York City longer than 6 months. I'm just mentioning it only because those on the other side, I guess on my side,
Come clear, Michael, come clear.
will raise that as another issue of quote-unquote voter fraud.
Well, I think my mic, that's okay. Well, for U.S. citizens, you have to, in New York State, you have to show that you've resided. You have to show that you've resided in the state for 30 days to be able to vote in the state. So theoretically, at least residence has to be shown by everyone. It's just that if you're a U.S. citizen, you would only need to show 30-day residence. But I think it's worth mentioning too that, in theory, you could live your entire life in San Diego, California, and then randomly at the age of 50, up and move to New York City. And 30 days later, you could vote in New York City elections. But if you're a non-citizen who's lived in New York City for 40 years, you can't vote. So I think it makes sense to tie it to residency when you think about that comparison, and it makes sense to sort of think about why that residency requirement is there.
And to say that an individual that is an American citizen could actually have an affidavit that says, yes, trust me, I'm an American citizen. But somebody that is not an American citizen cannot be trusted to do the same. I think it's outrageous. If we believe that a hardworking American citizen should be trusted to sign and check off, yes, I indeed have the right to vote, I think that the same thing should be said of a hardworking non-American citizen that says, yes, I too have the right to vote.
I raise that only because that's not part of this whole voter ID movement in the States to avoid voter fraud. It's always been an affidavit that you sign saying that I, Michael Benjamin, am a legal citizen of New York, the state of the United States, and I am eligible to vote in the state. I'm just raising it as another issue of are signing an affidavit saying, well, I've been in New York City for 6 months. That's all. That's the only thing I'm not raising. It's the same issue for anyone who registered to vote in New York. I mean, non-citizens can register to vote now and lie in an affidavit, then be subject to a felony.
Michael, are you saying that there should be more proof of residency?
No, I don't want additional proof because I think that blocks people from voting. I think persons should legitimately move towards a path towards citizenship, and then once they acquire citizenship, to vote.
Okay, Michael, listen. Honestly, look, the most progressive bill was the Senate passed that I think we're going to get for a while, right? Now, in that bill, so-called progressive bill, it's going to take anywhere from 10 to 15 years to become a citizen from the moment that person applies. You're going to allow our community to spend 15 years waiting to be a citizen, take their taxes, take their contributions, and not allow them to have a say? Is that what you really want?
That's the deal.
So we did have another question from the audience.
Hi, I actually have two questions, but if you can only answer one, that's fine. Going back to the topic about undocumented, I'm actually thinking about the people who benefit from the deferred action that were able to prove that when they came here, how they came here, they had clearance by Homeland Security, they were able to get employment authorization, they were able to get driver's license, so they have a state ID. Like, what can we say to these people who are they're non-legal residents, but they are kind of like in limbo in a way in the legal system? The other question was about the history of non-citizen voting, because obviously this is not the first time this has happened in this country. Like, has there been any other, is there any past strategy that maybe we can start thinking of to use or implement for what's coming? Those are my questions.
Thank you. So on panel like to do that?
I just wanted to I just wanted to respond to the first question about folks with DACA. So it's deferred action for childhood arrivals. That's the executive action that President Obama instituted a few years back. So the language in the proposed law says anyone can vote who's been here for 6 months and who is, quote, lawfully present. It's not clear what that language means, lawfully present. In immigration law, it has no real definition because there are so many kinds of statuses that you can have as a non-citizen, and lawfully present doesn't mean it, it's too vague. So it's hard to say what lawfully present does not mean. It's easier to say what it certainly does mean. It does mean someone with a green card. It does mean someone who's an asylee. It also probably does mean someone who has DACA. In theory, someone with DACA, because they can get a driver, this is why they can get work authorization. They're here lawfully with the government's acquiescence and knowledge, and that in theory is probably the best definition you can get for lawfully present, here with the government's knowledge and acquiescence. So my interpretation of the statute would be that DACA, folks with DACA would be eligible to vote under that provision.
Someone like to take the second part of this question?
Sure. So the question about making sure that we're reaching out to other communities that have had success with this. Our coalition, the American Coalition to Expand Voting Rights, actually has worked with the folks from Maryland. And when this came up for debate in City Council last year, they actually had someone who was part of the administration of this Maryland County testify in support and explain to the council what the logistics were about the wearables and how they ended up there. So, great suggestion. We're in touch and hopefully some of their good luck will rub off on us.
So we'd like to go to one last question from the audience.
Yeah. One of the things that I was thinking is that even within the legal spectrum, people that are green card holder, if they do not dominate the English language, they have to wait 20, 15 years in order to become citizens. So, they are in a situation that they want to be part of this country, but yet, because they don't dominate the language, whatever language it is, and they don't speak English language, they are prevented from being able to exercise their rights.
Yes,
And by the way, that's Gino Manalo, the co-founder of LinkedIn, like Francis, and he's the one that really deals with all these issues. So the man knows that in order to get around this English-only approach, you have to be 50 years old and have lived in a residence for 20 years. So, you know, or you can be 55 and you know, it is an equivalency there, and have lived less years as a resident. But I just think that's immoral, you know, to have people working hard, paying their taxes so many years, you know, because someone somewhere is imposing an English-only approach to our democracy.
So this is the last question. Go ahead.
Hi, good evening, Maria. My question is, you know, it's actually for Mr. Benjamin, maybe others who also would kind of like sharing your expertise, understanding of the system. So it is clear we've spoken about how this actually has been implemented in other states. You mentioned Maryland, I believe, and also countries such as England and the UK. My question is, I've actually one is a statement, one is a question. So the question is kind of, if we're not going to, let's say, implement this new system, we're not going to have a system where we're going to kind of give a voice to those that don't have a voice, but that are physically present and that reside, to non-citizens that reside here. And here we are electing representatives to represent this community. How then does these representatives intend to meet the needs of the community if you're not recognizing the voices? So, you know, especially of those that are undocumented and, you know, that are not citizens for whatever reason. So my question is, how then would a representative address those needs if it's not, if they're not being heard?
In other words, they're not voting so that the representative really understands where his vote is coming from. Then how is that a portion of the community that's basically invisible to that representative because they're not dealing with them since they can't vote? How does the voice get heard? And how does that voice have the kind of power that it should have as a resident? That's your question.
Hopefully they're heard because they organize and they're still residents of your district and they have needs, they have issues, and they come to you and they talk to you. When I was in office, I never listened to a person whether they were a Dominican, U.S. citizen, or Dominican from the Republic, or a person from West Africa. You're a resident of my district, there are resources, you then share in them, and I represent your interests. When I'm in Albany, to make sure the entirety of my community is served. I would visit mosques, I would visit Spanish language churches, I would visit all the organizations that were in my district, whether I never asked a single person whether they were registered, whether they were even U.S. citizens. They live in the district, they deserve services, and it was my job to make sure they got services. And I never thought about, I want to get reelected those 8 years that I was there, but I never only focused on people who could vote for me. It was about talking to everyone, and they talk to everybody else, make sure they're organized, and they get their interests heard, and we move forward. And that's the way I believe many of my former colleagues in the Bronx behave that way. And I want to believe that others across the city and across the state also behave that way. And otherwise, we need to make sure, by organizing, that people like that who don't represent their entire communities should be serving in public office.
I mean, that's commendable, and I commend you for being that type of political figure. But the reality is that at the end of the day, we don't have unlimited resources. And politicians have to make tough decisions. And, part of that decision is, do I want to be reelected? So if I have two factions of my constituency, one that brings out 1,000 people, and out of those 1,999 are voters, and the other one brings out 1,000 people, and out of that, only 2 are voters, and I have limited resources. Who gets it? Am I going to stand on the moral ground and say, I believe that these people should get it, and I'm going to be out of office tomorrow? Or you know what, the ideas and the issues are similar, but I have 999 votes that I will lose. I'll go with this group